So I would like to introduce Tanya Harrod.
We're going to be discussing ceramic practice as a medium of social change and resistance. And this is a challenging conceptualization of ceramics when we consider the work of vernacular potters, often women, hand building all over the world, the functionality of their pots still outfacing plastic and metal containers of all kinds. And then there is the ceramics industry, increasingly automated and moving almost entirely out of Europe, with companies chasing a mix of skills and cheap labor in the Far East, a kind of homecoming in a way. And then we have the studio potter, often working alone, at first sight, a fulfilled and somewhat apolitical figure. And then the multidisciplinary artist who's drawn to clay for a range of reasons. And I want to start really by looking at him, her, or them working as a potter in studio and asking ourselves about social change and resistance in that context. I think all of us mourn the passing of Richard Batterham, the potter of Weston, Dorset, who led a life of extraordinary, it's rather hard to find the word, purity, I suppose. When I first met Richard back in the late 1980s, I was particularly immersed in what I saw as the radical end of studio ceramics, in particular the work of figures like Gordon Baldwin, Ruth Duckworth, and Gillian Lowndes. Their kind of practice, which emerged in the 1950s, was not perhaps aiming at social change, but within the world of ceramics. As it abuts the fine art world, Baldwin, Duckworth and Lowndes and others then offered a form of resistance to our conceptions of what ceramics might be. But when I arrived at Weston in Dorset and saw the completeness of the place and met Richard and Dinah, his wife, I realized I was witnessing another kind of radicalism, a form of dissent that had perhaps a greater political dimension, as well as seeming to connect with all kinds of areas of visual art and music by virtue of being concerned with seriality and economy of means. Batterham, the man and the work, suggested that it's possible to live a life governed by certain fiercely held beliefs in which work is, as Batterham hoped, love made visible. With Richard in mind, I'd like to argue that craft practice, and that of course includes ceramics, has in our industrial and post-industrial worlds always possessed the potential for social change and resistance. Choosing craft, an entire commitment to craft, necessarily means choosing a life less ordinary. In a 2018 reader entitled Craft that I edited for the Whitechapel series Documents of Contemporary Art, I argued for craft as a highly strategic activity, able to confront a multiple series of issues, gender and uneven development, for example, or consciously or unconsciously making a stand against artistic narrowness, and invariably able to throw light on the politics of work. All this while mostly maintaining the integrity of a discrete object or objects. We live in a world where the worker is treated increasingly harshly. Standards in the workplace are falling, and we're witnessing or ignoring deplorable conditions of work that are cloaked by the category self-employed. In fact, what is offered is a cruel parody of an apparent freedom, self-employment, that denies workers any of the protections traditionally offered by conventional work situations, protections that were written into labour relations after the Second World War and earlier. Right now, therefore, craft, broadly defined, can appear exemplary and telling in all kinds of ways, self-employment as it might be. These themes will, I'm sure, be further and more deeply explored by our speakers, but I'd like to offer one or two examples that mean a lot to me personally. And one is a creative scrutiny of older ways of working. They form one big area of interest. And in my reader, Craft, for the Whitechapel series, I included an account by the radical Italian architect, Alessandro Poli, who was deeply inspired by a Tuscan peasant who we come to know as Zeno. Zeno, in his workshop or working with his vines, traveling the countryside on hidden paths, offered Poli during the 1960s and 70s a model for designing based on reuse. For Poli, Zeno was a great planner, a great artist, a great wizard, voyaging through the 19th century like an astronaut, continually improvising with a workshop of existing scraps. And here are just some of the objects made by Zeno and recorded by Poli, a tool for retrieving objects that have fallen into a well, a container for preparing copper sulfate solution to treat vines. And here a little group of objects, some the objects above designed to support crops and vines, and below a strainer in which to put powders and liquids to treat plants. All these things made by Zeno, improvisatory and humble, by one man who remained in the deep countryside, which was in fact fast being abandoned by most of its inhabitants for urban life. This meant a huge amount to the architect, Alessandro Poli. He saw Zeno as an ad hoc designer, a recycler, a great reuser who outfaced contemporary consumer society. Zeno was in fact a producer of wine and olive oil, in that sense, a professional worker. But I think his approach reminds us that anyone who makes stuff outside what we might call the system, sitting at a sewing machine, tinkering in a garden shed, using time in ways that bypass conventional consumption and economic systems that discipline and bind us, is doing something rather extraordinary, something that needs to be valued. As another example of older ways of working, the great Italian oral historian Giovanni Contini recorded the largely unrecognized skills of Tuscan marble quarrymen. He interviewed them from 1984 onwards, discovering that their deep understanding of finding good marble outfaced the expertise of the mining engineers and other qualified professionals who were put in directorial and management roles from the 1960s onwards in these quarries. The quarrymen, Contini learnt, could find good marble with an understanding that, as Contini discovered, echoes ancient animism, when it was believed that everything in nature had a soul. These quarrymen lived in a world in which the marble is alive. Meanwhile, the engineers have their degrees, their pieces of paper, and undoubtedly higher salaries. But in those Tuscan quarries, it was acknowledged that they didn't know how to find the good marble. Tacit knowledge like that is hard to measure, hard to quantify in an audit culture. But as we're beginning to realize, it's undervalued at our peril, as whole systems of understanding are passing away almost unnoticed. We cannot, however, recreate the past or the fast approaching past artificially. What Craft can do is research, memorialize, and comment. And here we can turn to Neil Brownsword, who is really the Pindar of the British ceramics industry. and his projects all have a startling impact and authenticity. He was originally started out as an apprentice modeler at Wedgwood before he decided to go to art school. And since then, his aim has been to memorialize and record factory processes that are being lost and which are undervalued. This is part of his piece, Salvage, of 2005. And here, Waster, which is now in the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery. And both these pieces pay attention to the marginal discarded things that come out of ceramic production. These include clay turnings, kiln furniture, staggers, and so on. And on the cover of the craft reader, we see another brown sword project. This is the German artist Alexander Engelfried participating in Brown Sword's site-specific project Marlhole in the Gorsty clay quarry, traditionally where red Etruria clay was mined. Currently, Brown Sword is working with former employees from the industry. And here we see Rita Floyd making porcelain flowers by hand at speed. On completion, she throws each finished flower onto a pile of other examples, and we see her day by day workings stretching into the foreground. She's working in a new way, performing her craft, with each discarded flower a reflection on the decline of the ceramics industry in Great Britain. She started working in Stoke factories at the age of 15 in the early 70s, and she's been a China flower maker for over 30 years. She's taking part in Neil Brownswell's project Factory, which he initiated in South Korea in 2017. So Brownsword and those he chooses to work with take us, I think, a long way aesthetically and politically. Craft as a form of resistance and memory. And for craft that seeks to make a political point head on, in my craft reader, I included Susan Bean's essay, Gandhi and Khadi, Fabric of Independence, from that great book of essays, Cloth and Human Experience, edited by Weiner and Schneider. Mahatma Gandhi's endorsement of hand spinning and weaving under empire was one of the most striking examples of craft being used as a political force in the face of oppressive government. But other examples are not hard to find. There was Magdalena Abanikovic, is textile work made in Cold War Poland, an example of radical craft made under the radar, employing the craft of weaving. So art was heavily censored, but weaving didn't come under that kind of species of Cold War art censorship. And this was also true of sculptural Czech glass. Here we see the work of Jaroslavla Brichova and Stanislav Nebensky, their River of Life that was shown at the 1970 Expo in Osaka, much to their government's displeasure. But politics works in multiple ways in craft. And I'll end with this image of Theaster Gates' Seoul Manufacturing Corporation, one of his socially inspired ceramic projects that began in Chicago, but have now been staged all over the world, which does something rather different, suggesting making as community, and by extension, as he puts it, inviting people into a set of hopeful ideas and thereby creating a more hopeful city life. It's a challenge to the harsh logic of neoliberal economics, which demands that government-backed social support is scaled down and stripped away. Well, I hope you'll forgive me for introducing some of my own thoughts this morning. And I know we'll return to some of the themes I've raised.